after the last one has given his remarks, we're going to have what I think will be a very interesting and entertaining panel, if they can stay awake. We hope they will. So we're going to start with the big question. We had a very long, drawn-out campaign. We had a very surprising outcome to a presidential election. So what do you see as the economic changes, policy changes that we're going to see coming out of Washington in the next year or two?
Well, I'll start. You're going to see big changes. Elliott mentioned it, Ron mentioned it too. Because you have the GOP control the presidency and both houses of Congress, I think what you'll see is what you see when this happened in 2008 as well. You'll see a lot of changes for 3 or 4 or 5 months, and then things will kind of grind to a halt after that. It'll be much slower. So all the things people are talking about, repealing a lot of legislation, a lot of regulations, I expect to see those kinds of things occur rather quickly. The quicker they happen, then the quicker we can adjust to whatever the new normal is going to be.
I agree. I think that it is hard to believe the scale of this change. We have 2 completely different views of the world between Obama and Trump. It is massive, and it's whether or not Trump is able to implement it depends on how far he goes. If he gets us into trade wars, we got problems. But for 2 years at least, he can kind of do whatever he wants because he's got a Republican Congress, a Republican president, and he's got a private sector mentality. Personally, I like the idea that this guy is used to signing the front of the check instead of the back of the check, because he basically will be an administrator. He's not going to be a micromanager.
Dissenting opinion?
Dissenting opinion? Well, I think the question is Trump going to do what he says, or is he simply going to do something different? And what he says and what he does may be 2 different things. My guess is that he will start out with some of the, maybe we call it low-hanging fruit. I think certainly cutting back on a lot of regulation, which has been creeping up at a high rate for several years. That's one thing he can do, cut back on regulation. And I think he can tackle corporate tax reform fairly quickly as well. I think there's an appetite for that right now. And if he goes into that, that's going to be a substantive change that's going to be fairly significant. And that might be something that can be accomplished, again, given that the Republicans have control of both houses of the Congress as well. So, yeah, it's a difference, different outlook, and it's a matter of maybe how quickly some changes take place, and also, you know, whether it's not going to be quite as much as what you might have heard during the campaign.
So one of the more interesting things that occurred kind of 24 hours after the election is I think at one point Dow futures were down 900 points. And I didn't look at the end of the day. The last time I looked, they were up 200 in the actual trading day. I don't know where they finished. So that leads to the next question. There are going to be short-term impacts and longer-term impacts. Could you share your thoughts on kind of what we'll see in the short term in terms of not what President-elect Trump might do, but what the impacts and outcomes will be? And then we'll go comment on longer-term impacts.
Are you looking at the market, the stock market?
No, I'm thinking more broadly than that.
Well, there's clearly going to be not only no new regulations, there's going to be a reduction in the level of regulation. He doesn't like them, and he plans to get rid of a lot of regulation. That's positive. I really believe that the change in tax rates is a near-term deal. I believe that the change in Obamacare, I don't know how he's going to handle it, but that's a near-term deal. Now, I will tell you personally that my wife's insurance went from $400 a month to $800 a month in 1 year. Okay? Obamacare isn't working, period. And you can see that because insurers are running from it because they're not being subsidized for the losses like the government said they were going to initially. So something's got to change there. And I believe that he's going to, in the near term, be playing a lot of poker with our allies to try to essentially get money back here and less sent overseas. And I don't care if it's defending Japan or it's the UN initiative on global warming. He wants to bring that money back here and deal with water and clean air issues in the United States rather than worry about it overseas. It's just so different. It really is.
More of an isolationist viewpoint in some ways, I think, in terms of trying to bring things back. And that has appeal sometimes, but on the other hand, I think there's a lot of downside to that as well. And it's certainly scary when it comes to the trade issue, and I think we may get into trade later. But any increase in the barriers to trade that cuts back on the trade that's been picking up over the last few years, I find is one of the more scary parts of a Trump presidency.
I think to get to the issue about the business sector, the way I see it is that there's this uptick in optimism. And then even though it was a kind of a 50-50 election and the voters are split down the middle, I think the business sector is going to embrace this for a while. Now, that may be just a half a year, and then that may change. But I think at least initially that's going to drive some interesting changes. Down the road, as Elliott and Ron both mentioned, if we start seeing some of these effects in terms of trade, then all bets are off again. But at least for a while, I think that's going to be driving quite a lot of positive change. But again, short term.
So we mentioned a number of things that we think President Trump might do, that President-elect Trump might do that would be positive, and at least one that might be negative. So what do you think are the biggest mistakes he can make in the first 100 days of his presidency?
Well, anything that affects trade negatively. Again, the interesting thing with the man is he has no filter, so you know exactly what he thinks. But he also is a very famous poker player. He likes to push things to the limit, and then he can back off. So I think you're going to see some of that. Hopefully he backs off the quote-unquote wall, because quite frankly, the issue is to get immigrants with criminal records out of town. But the reality is, if anybody in construction here, how you doing with construction workers? You can't find them, can you? And that's because they're not coming north from south of the border. And the real interesting thing is when you talk to them, you find out the real reason has nothing to do with 1070, has something to do with E-Verify, but the real issue is it used to cost $3,000 to get you across the border. Now it costs $8,000 to $10,000. It's becoming cost prohibitive, especially when you're getting 20 pesos per dollar. So he's got to do something to get labor. So when you have a construction boom that would naturally follow what he was talking about, you have labor to build it. So I hope he backs off on that as well.
I think another issue is the kind of the consensus issue. If he wants to embrace consensus or not, and that's even just within the Republican Party. I can easily imagine him picking a fight with the Republican leaders in the House and the Senate, and that's kind of the way we think about business. He's the CEO; he should be able to direct all this. But these are all politicians, and they don't see it that way. So that could be a potential problem over the next half year or so.
Yeah, those are a couple of things. I'd like to add one more. I mean, I think the messing with trade would be a bad start. Building the wall, which I don't think will happen, but that would obviously not be good. We need more labor here, not less. And the third one is don't mess with the Fed. I'm very concerned, that he may want to do some things there. They are supposed to be politically independent. There's a reason for that, and there's history when there has been some interference that it's not good, and that would be another one of my big fears.
Let me ask you, Dennis, is there anything the Fed could possibly do to change things in the near term?
Well, they'd have to. I think if they stopped rolling over their debt and they say, well, we're going to unwind these quantitative easing programs, that would sort of go along with what I'm arguing earlier. That's like a 20-year strategy, though, and nobody has the patience for that. Although I will say, if we can talk about the Fed for a second, this will probably be the first time in 40 years, 35, 40 years, that you won't have a president of an opposite party reselect the current Fed chairman. We had President Carter selected, President Reagan reselected Paul Volcker, President Reagan selected Greenspan, Bush reselected him, Clinton reselected him, President Bush II selected Bernanke, President Obama reselected him, but I'm pretty sure Trump's not going to reselect Janet Yellen.
Could be a problem.
Interesting. So all of you have mentioned trade, international trade, on numerous occasions. Anyone who's traveled to China regularly over the last few years, you might have noticed that there are massive construction projects in China that are sitting idle. Massive, big high-rises, nothing going on because of the slow growth in their economy. So trade works both ways. So what things do you think might happen, not in terms just of trade barriers, but of more global trade, Brexit, those sorts of things that might impact us here?
Well, I'll mention monetary policy, which kind of fits in with this, and we're in this weird sort of thing with the zero interest rate and this idea of negative interest rates in Europe and in Japan. To me, that's like the biggest long-term barrier to economic growth, which is going to be the thing that's going to benefit trade.
I would take a shot at it too, and that is that the reality is the devil's in the details with trade. He obviously feels that it's not a level playing field with certain countries. I quite frankly don't know the detail of that, and I didn't worry about it because with Obama it didn't seem to matter, so it wasn't a big deal. For Trump it's a big deal, so we're going to have to look at those details and see where it's not a level playing field, and I think that's where he'll be most disruptive, where it's not a level playing field.
Yes, I had exactly the same feeling that the level playing field is probably something that we may be giving up more than we should on that in some of these arrangements in the past. I don't know the details either, but for the most part, we can't scrap the deals or we can't begin to raise tariffs because then we probably get into a scenario of retaliation. And we don't want to get into retaliation with China raising tariffs and then they raise their tariffs and then there'll be even less construction going on in these areas. And that's some of my major fears, that you try to get one ahead of your competitors, and that never produces a good outcome for either side. And therefore, looking back at history, free trade has been one of the major growth activities that's helped our economy, and certainly South China. We can't afford to go back on that, and there's absolutely no reason for him to be talking like that about increasing the possibility of scrapping those arrangements. Looking at the details might be something else.
So if we could continue on China for just a second. We have a massive goods trade deficit with China, but we actually have a services trade surplus with China. And so with the growth and the share of the economy from services, how do you think that plays out with international trade, particularly with China?
Well, again, it depends on how they react to whatever President Trump would do. And I have no idea exactly, again, the devil's in the details, so I just have generalities. And, but if it becomes overweighted in our direction, they will react. And that will affect all trade, both manufactured goods and services, I believe.
And of course, what we've seen already in terms of the goods industries in China, it's too expensive for some of people to produce there. So what has happened? It's gone to Indonesia, it's gone to Bangladesh, it's gone to Vietnam, it's gone to other places which are even cheaper to produce some of these goods than in China. So yeah, it's a rolling change. Let's say we say, well, it's too expensive to manufacture here. Now it's too expensive to manufacture in China, and things keep moving like that. That's just part of healthy economic progress, I think, as you're trying to find the most efficient way to get the production done, whether it's goods or service.
I will also say, last night when I rewrote the presentation, I read an awful lot of articles again because I skimmed some, waiting for a reporter to call over the last 3 months and ask me about it. There's like not one reporter, I'm just dumbfounded. He called and asked me about that. But I will tell you that the press is so used to the status quo that they didn't treat any of Trump's proposals evenly. It just was really kind of bizarre. So I think it also depends on how this plays out in the press. It's way too early to tell how it's going to play out. I will tell you that 4 of the 5 things that I think create growth, I'm good with the way he's talking about things. The last one, I don't know enough to say this is going to be a disaster or this is going to be okay.
And that's the trade.
That's the trade.
Dennis, anything to add?
I'm good.
So where does that stop you? So let's shift gears for
Okay.
Let's shift gears for just a second. So several times during the presentations, we saw references to unemployment, to productivity growth rates declining, things like that. So in October, the national unemployment rate was around 4.9%. And when I was in school, that was below what was considered full employment. So it was around 5%. But labor force participation is at historic lows. So what does this mean? What's going on with this? What's causing it? Is it the new normal?
A lot of those things. First of all, yes, we are at levels that traditionally would have been considered full employment levels, and the part that doesn't always surface is that because of the lower participation rates and people dropping out of the market, then they don't become counted any longer as part of the employment base, and as a result, it's really a deceptively low figure because a lot of people have dropped out, discouraged workers, people have taken early retirement, a lot of baby boomers who have acquired a lot of assets over their lifetime decided to quit early. So that's somewhat a misleading number, but it also is, it makes it look fairly healthy in some sense. But yeah, it's a way of looking at things with maybe an outdated variable that we can't put as much stock in as we used to.
And I'd also tell you, if there was a problem with labor, it would show up in wage rates, and it hasn't yet.
Exactly, yeah. The wage rates, they've been coming up a little, right? This last year, we have seen a little firming up of the wage rates, and that could be, because of some pockets of growth and some increases that are slowly being or emerging here in the economy. So there's some of that, but you're right. The biggest indicator, if we had a problem, would be raising wages, and there's been very little of that.
I would also say that there obviously has to be some way for people to survive. Otherwise, you can't just drop out of the labor force and say, well, I'm not going to work anymore. So there's this different environment that we have than we've had in the past. You go back 100 years, and it's like, well, if you don't work, you don't survive. But these days, we have all kinds of different kinds of programs in place that can go towards that point, which then what is full employment becomes the question. It's like, well, nobody really knows anyway, but maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 6% unemployment, maybe it's a lower labor force participation rate, and that's going to change structurally over time.
So speaking of wages, we had an outcome here in Flagstaff that raised the minimum wage, which was touched on a little bit during the presentations. And I wonder if we could explore a little bit more what some of the positive and negative outcomes of the growing trend towards a higher minimum wage, and especially when it's not national, when it's market-based.
I am not a believer in the minimum wage. If you wanted the minimum wage, why don't you make everybody rich? Why don't we make the minimum wage $100,000 a year? Won't everybody be rich? You know what would happen if that happened. Well, it'd be inflation through the roof. Well, there's only 4 ways that things can work out. You either lose your job, you have fewer hours, you have higher consumer prices or you have lower profits if you can't pass through those costs. Minimum wage doesn't work. If somebody is not productive enough to get X number of dollars an hour, guess what's going to happen? His employer is going to replace him. There'll be a trade-off of capital for labor, or he'll find somebody who's more productive and can do a better job at that higher wage rate. The bottom line is the guy who needs that job, the guy who's right out of high school, needs to learn the basics of jobs, needs to learn the very showing up on time, how to interact with people, how to do all this basic stuff. They won't be able to get on that ladder because they're not productive enough. So that some people will have higher wages, but it won't be the people who really need the job, in my opinion. Now, I'm probably sounding like Attila the Hun, and I don't need to, but the reality is it's a market-based economy. And if you're going to artificially create a price, again, you're going to either have a trade-off of capital for labor, you're going to work less hours, you're going to have higher consumer prices, or you're going to have lower profits. Those are the only possible outcomes. One more.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Another problem, I mean, all those things are correct. One of the other problems that struck me is that, well, what happens when we do have the next recession? Even if you still have workers at 15, well, or 12, or whatever it's been raised to by then, you can't like renegotiate and keep them on for 11 or 10 or 9. It's like, no, you're going to have to let them go. So I would think that the next recession is going to exacerbate some of those problems. And like you say, if you look at the data, it's the young worker, it's the one that doesn't have a lot of education, a lot of skills, and you make it harder for them to even get started. And it's like, well, how does that really help them over their working career? I don't really think it does.
Yeah, and I hate to agree all the time, or even a little bit of the time with Dennis and Elliott. But this one's pretty easy. In my mind, no economist can support minimum wage and be true to their profession. It is not an efficient way to tackle the problem. And I look back to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and so on. He says, well, you can always trust the Americans to do the right thing after they have tried everything else. And we have to keep trying something else on this. In addition to the factors that Elliott and Dennis have already brought up, the minimum wage only helps the people who can continue to keep their jobs and those who are, employed. But a lot of the people who need the help aren't even employed, and all it does is raise the prices for them and everybody else because cost of production go up, prices are going to go up. It's just not a good idea. I just really can't say anymore. It has no merit at all.
I will add too, as Elliott mentioned, it's really a market phenomenon. When I first came here, we didn't have a very high minimum wage in the country, and it seemed to me that all the minimum wage jobs at Flagstaff were $1 or $2 above the minimum, and it's because of our particular market was such that was the equilibrium wage. And then since then, the minimum wages have been passed, and that's kind of surpassed what had been our equilibrium.
So this is pushed the election outcome to the second most surprising event of the past few days. We have 3 economists that agree. And I'm trying to process this. I'm rattled at the moment. But Ron, you mentioned we need to try something else. I mean, we've got a definite problem with income disparity for the working poor. A lot of people are hurting out there. If it's not a minimum wage increase, what are something else that we could try?
Well, a much broader approach is incomes policies. Now, there's less chance of getting that passed through various legislators and Congress and so on. But certainly that's a broader approach because it can be tailored toward everybody who's below the poverty level and who needs it. And it can be worked out in various ways. I mean, it could be in rebates, or it could be in other forms of tax credits and other ways in which you can manipulate the policy to do that. So that would certainly be a much broader approach that I would.
Yeah, I would much rather see a negative income tax and do away with welfare. Let people decide how they're going to spend their money. I think that welfare rolls have ballooned, not only because of what's going on in the economy, but because the incentives have changed. Really, they're perverse, in my opinion. But the bottom line is that minimum wage really doesn't work, and I don't know where you're going to get the political will, as you said, to go with a negative income tax.
So a quick follow-on question. So we talked about productivity declines in the growth of productivity rates, right? And so can a minimum wage increase, will that force increases in productivity rate? Is there any way that could happen?
I think it'll force greater productivity in those people who are employed, but I don't think they're going to be the same people who are employed now.
No, I don't think so. We become more productive when we undertake new innovations or when new ways of doing things come into the economy, and most of the time those are surprises that take hold. I mean, it is things, when we had the big space program and the military buildup, a lot of things fell out of that kind of an increase. If you go back much further, the invention of electricity and the internal combustion engine and air conditioning and things like this, and then of course more recently the internet, those things like that. They are big changes in the economy that come at various periods of time, and we just haven't had another one of those big changes recently that has impacted productivity and employment and so on. And until we get one of those, I don't see the chance of productivity increasing, to counter the trend that's been happening over the last 70 years. And so I don't see the minimum wage as being a major player in that.
Granted that Ron has seen all of these things happen in his lifetime. I think that the other problem that we all, I think, mentioned a little bit is the regulation. Regulations just don't go away. They just keep adding more and more and more. I tell my students about how way back in the past, when we would create a central bank called the First Bank of the United States, we gave it a 20-year lifespan, and then it expired. And it's like today, nothing expires, and you just keep adding more and more and more. And I think that's the long-term problem. Each individual regulation may not seem like that big a deal. Each marginal change may not seem like that big a deal, but the cumulative effect, I think, is what we see exhibited in things like productivity and innovation in our economy.
And it's insidious. By that I mean, if you were at productivity growth of 3%, you basically have a doubling in the standard of living, every 24 years, okay? It falls, let's say, to 1.5%. Yeah, that's not bad. Well, then the standard of living doubles about every 40 some odd years. Well, think about that. 40 years from now, your kids will have twice the standard of living as you do, instead of 4 times the standard of living. They won't even know what they lost because they never had it. But because of various policies, and I really think this is policy driven, that the rate of productivity growth will prevent them from having what they otherwise should have had. But nobody knows it because they never had it. It's insidious.
Yes, and I certainly have to agree with this, that the regulations have been perhaps a dampening factor on productivity all this time. And in my mind, forcing firms to pay a minimum wage is just one more regulation. So in that sense, it's been counter to the trend that many would hope for, many business people would hope for. We have fewer regulations, and that means also less of a need to say, oh, now you have to pay your workers more.
One last question, and you each get 1 minute to answer this. Can you leave us, and this is going to be tough for you, Ron, in multiple ways, can you leave us with one positive, uplifting thought as we go into the break?
Well, I will. First of all, you're still in the United States of America. And you now have a president, well, I'll say it, you have a president who will actually follow the Constitution. That's good news. But the bottom line is, we have an opportunity for the first time, probably since the first Clinton, who was completely different in my opinion than the second Clinton, to actually see the economy grow at rapid rates, create all sorts of jobs, have people feel good about themselves again. And that is tremendous news to me. It's not more of the same. The definition of, and what I was going to say in when it was the Clinton presentation, was the definition of insanity, as you all know, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting big results. Well, if she was using Obama's policies, guess what? You're going to get Obama's results. Now at least we have a chance to break that. I don't know what's going to happen. Could be a disaster. Could be great. It's too early to tell. But the opportunity now exists. I think that's terrific.
I have a couple of things. One is I really do think we're going to have this window of optimism for a 2, 3, 4 months, something like that. And then the big question is whether that's going to continue, whether there's going to be changes that will push that on, or whether it will just kind of wither away sometime in the summer. So I feel that that's kind of a positive change here coming up. The other, I would say still big positive thing is that the Broncos could repeat. They still could repeat. You may be seeing the names around here next year.
Okay. Well, actually, the fact that we now have a president and both sides of the Congress, both the Senate and the House, all with the Republicans, we may actually be able to tackle tax reform. Individual tax reform, corporate tax reform, estate taxes. We have over the years put together policies that just can't be making a lot of sense to even the people that first envisioned those, and we need a lot of tax reform. And maybe this is a chance to kind of tackle that problem, if nothing else. So I'm going to go with that one.
Let's thank our speakers, our panelists.